Good evening and welcome back. I'm your host, Josh Brewster. As you know, my guest tonight is author Jamie Glazov, and Jamie normally occupies the host seat here. Jamie, thanks for joining me, and welcome back to segment 2, where we talk about your life's work.
It's great to be on the other side. I like to be in the witness stand sometimes.
All right. Well, let's talk about United in Hate, the left's romance with tyranny and terror. This is a book that it packs a serious punch, Jamie, and I love its hard-hitting style. One thing about United in Hate that you discuss early on in the book, you call the book, the intention of your book here is a book, United in Hate is a book on the impulses that stimulate the radical mind and that have led to its love affair with radical Islam. Talk to me first off, Jamie, about what you describe as the believer's diagnosis.
Well, thank you very much, Josh. And to get to that, what inspired me to write it and to try to understand the believers. So to go back with where we ended up in the second segment, these leftist intellectuals who wanted to shut up my dad and shut up my mom and smeared them till this day, calling them fascist and racist because they cared for human rights. And because these scoundrels, and they are the moral gutter and moral sewer of our society. That's what the left is. They didn't give a damn about the people that suffered and died under the Khmer Rouge and under Mao and under Castro and under the Soviet regime. They wanted to destroy democratic capitalism. And because of that, they turn a blind eye to the victims. Now, so as I was growing older and I saw these people, these leftists, and how much they not just wanted to drown my parents out, but how much they adored Castro. We see it till this day,
sure.
Oliver Stone and Sean Penn, and we see, these are the political pilgrims, the fellow travelers. They loved Stalin and they loved Mao. We had a Prime Minister, Pierre Trudeau, that loved Mao. Look at, what was her name? None. In the Obama's administration that has left, but when she came in and said that one of her heroes was Mao. I mean, they're all over the place. And so I wanted, as a young child, I was thinking, why are you worshiping? Why are you venerating these mass murderers? What is in these people to worship these entities by which they themselves would be devoured? There's a tremendous history of the leftists traveling to the Soviet Union to build communism during the Bolshevik Revolution and then killed. Traveling to China, then killed. In Nicaragua, the same thing happened. In Cuba, today, we see even in our jihadi war, we see the leftist feminists going to Gaza, getting raped by the terrorists that they support. We see even during the Khomeini time how many leftist Iranians returned to Iran to build the revolution only to be devoured by the killing fields. So these revolutions that eat their children, what is the inspiration of the people that support these revolutions? So Naomi Klein, the leftist writer for The Nation, after 9/11, several years afterwards, she said, "Bring Najaf to New York," in one of her articles, the title. Why would a leftist feminist want to bring Najaf to New York? Najaf are the killing fields of al-Sadr. This is where women were gang raped and had their eyes gouged out. Yep. She would be killed within 30 seconds of contact with the force that she's supporting. So, I apologize for my tirade. What is this mentality? And so in United in Hate, I wanted to give an explanation of what draws the Naomi Klein towards the entity that will destroy her. And so there's a chapter in here called The Believer's Diagnosis, sure, where I diagnose this illness, this death wish, that a Noam Chomsky, a Jew, would go to Lebanon and embrace
Hezbollah on the eve of them chucking 10,000 missiles into Israel.
Right, and
yeah,
you're a Jew and you're
sure,
embracing,
yeah,
and bowing to the entity that wants to devour you. And
yep,
so the believer's diagnosis is my diagnosis of what draws the left to totalitarian.
Well, it's funny, you say, excuse my tirade. If it wasn't for your tirade, we wouldn't really have a good analysis of these fellow travelers. And you've really put something out there that gives us quite a good picture through time And it's time-tested. Bertolt Brecht and George Bernard Shaw admiring Joseph Stalin. New York Times Moscow correspondent Walter Duranty,
yes.
who, as you put it, quote, deliberately spiked news of the Ukrainian famine. Then later, you talk about Susan Sontag, Norman Mailer, Jean-Paul Sartre in aiding and promoting Castro.
Yes.
Then it goes on, China, Vietnam, Nicaragua, of course, and then predictably, the left either embraces or, in my view, worse, ignores radical Islam, the new flavor of totalitarianism.
It's the new political pilgrimage.
Right. So, but we have one after the other. Now, Oliver Stone's going to come out with this piece of garbage movie, and he's got this affinity for Castro, and then this one, and this one, and this one, and this one, and you talk about Ed Asner and Michael Douglas and this one array of celebrities, Sean Penn, and even more intellectual sorts, scholars. It's just an amazing story. These fellow travelers, Jamie, they keep coming to the surface. They never go away. We keep offering up another generation of fellow travelers.
Yes. And you know, you even see Piers Morgan with Ahmadinejad, how he behaves in his presence. Even with Larry King, with Putin, if you look at one of his interviews, he was almost touching the table, bowing to him. What is this phenomenon where there is this desire to worship and venerate the dictator who will destroy you? I will say this, that where does one start? But I'll start with one point. For the left, they dream of a nirvana on this earth. They believe in an earthly redemption. And by the way, David Horowitz is the man, is the intellectual giant who has explained all of this meticulously in Radical Sun and in his all.
Yeah, no one understands the left like David Horowitz. There's no question.
So they believe in a nirvana, a utopian on this earth. But because man is flawed and driven by self-interest, that cannot happen. And so there can only be a divine redemption. But for the leftists, there is an earthly redemption, and they are the self-appointed redeemers. And there's a carbon copy, Josh, with Christian imagery, because in Christianity it is Christ's blood that redeems man. In the left's ideology, the mutated carbon copy, it is man's blood that redeems the earth. In order to create nirvana on earth, there has to be a transformation, and there has to be blood, and it has to be human blood. And this is why they're attracted to human blood.
Mao Zedong wanted to kill a third of the population, you mentioned.
Yes, and why does the left adore him? So, but just wait. So what I wanted to say was, this is crucial. They hate themselves so much. Leftists hate themselves so much because they hate human nature and they hate man for what and who he is, that they themselves want to destroy their own individuality and blur into the totalitarian whole. So when you read the documented history that I put of these fellow travelers traveling to these monstrous societies and finding heaven, they want to lose themselves in the totalitarian monolith. They want to blur their own individuality into the totalitarian whole because they hate themselves and their own individualism, their own individual entities. It is no wonder that they are willing to not only sacrifice others, but to ultimately sacrifice their own flesh and blood for the idea. And the left ultimately is the sacrifice of human blood on the altar of utopian ideals.
Now, Paul Hollander's Political Pilgrims is obviously, Paul Hollander's obviously had a major impact on your work. You're obviously an admirer, correct? Political Pilgrims, the book.
Well, Josh, you stumbled onto something that actually means so much to me, because when I was 13 and I said to my father, "Why do these people like Castro, Dad? Dad, why do these people say, why are these people at the university, Dad, saying that, why do they like Stalin? Why are they apologizing for the Soviet Union?" And my father came up to me when I was 13 and gave me a book, and it was Paul Hollander's Political Pilgrims. And Paul Hollander is the godfather of this. He explained why all these leftists flock to these killing fields with adoration.
Yeah.
They went to the killing fields and found heaven. And I devoured that book at the age of 13. So Paul Hollander he set me on my intellectual journey.
And of course, as you lay out in your books, what they're presented, the fellow travelers are presented with a very rosy picture when they get there. And of course, behind the scenes, it's all kinds of carnage. But of course, whatever regime is accepting them as guests is showing them a spruced up version, spruced up Nicaraguan prison, when the actual Nicaraguan prisons are something entirely different.
But Josh, as not only are they deceived, They want to be.
They want to be. They're willfully blind.
Until this day, Josh, the leftists I know that till this day are saying, "Oh well, come on, there's no Muslim Brotherhood in the Obama administration. That's ridiculous." And I say to them, "I can show you the evidence. I can show you Frank Gaffney's new pamphlet at the Freedom Center, but you don't want to read it,
right?
Because if you read it, you would have to abandon your socialist faith.
Your whole worldview would collapse.
And because they're so wrapped up in their worldview and in their own identity, they will sacrifice the truth, and millions of people."
Okay, well, let's move on and talk about the new book, High Noon for America, The Coming Showdown. First of all, as you mentioned, this is a collection of symposia, and you have some very interesting figures. I got to tell you, when I picked up your book, I said, "Oh, maybe this will be kind of uneven. It's a symposium." But then I read it, and I had read many of these on Front Page, and I was like, wow, it's such a great gift to have all these people contributing one after the other. You've got Kenneth Levin, who wrote The Oslo Syndrome, which is one of the most important books of our time, if you ask me. Robert McFarlane, a former Soviet Lieutenant General Pacepa, correct? Pacepa, who admits, by the way, in your book, to having seen the cell where Raoul Wallenberg was held by the Soviets. And a whole array of people, including Natan Sharansky. And by the way, I want to mention Sharansky. When I read Fear No Evil about his story of his time in the Gulag and in the punishment cells, it occurred to me that no one was reading this.
Right.
You know, everyone was talking about Nelson Mandela and blah, blah, blah. Yes. What about Natan Sharansky?
Absolutely.
All those years in prison. So just tell me quickly about bringing together all those interesting people, and then we're going to get into the book itself. But that must have been quite interesting to look at your body of work and look at the names that you've assembled to speak with.
Well, thank you, Josh, and it's been such a privilege and such an honor to host symposiums with the brightest minds, the greatest experts, with some of the greatest heroes of our time. And David Horowitz was on several symposiums, but a symposium in this book about breaking faith and Radical Sun, and Natan Sharansky. So this was a tremendous opportunity for me to sit with these great heroes of our modern time. And to be able, here's another thing, why I wanted to do these symposiums and why I want to do the Glazov Gang and pursue this, Josh, as you say, nobody is talking about this. Is Anderson Cooper talking about it? Is Pierce Morgan talking about it? Our mainstream media, our higher literary culture is completely suffocated and controlled by the left. And so what I wanted to do in these symposiums was to bring the voices of courage and respect for the truth and for freedom, and to ask the questions that are not asked in this society.
And you know what's great about the book, Jamie, is that sometimes they'll have differing views, and they're generally in agreement on things. They'll have differing views, and there's all kinds of different angles that they take. Now, one thing I wanted to get into, which I think is actually, before we get into the Arab Spring and the jihadist issues in play here, you have a very interesting symposium which deals with the life of Alexander Solzhenitsyn, a sort of a complicating figure because of his various views. This was a very interesting symposium. Here's a man who wrote two of the most important books of the century, but a complicating figure, and I thought it was a very interesting symposium, especially considering your family's history.
Yes, absolutely. Look, on the one hand, it was Alexander Solzhenitsyn against the Soviet Empire, the Gulag Archipelago, a great man, and he paved the foundation for the truth and the battle against the Soviet regime. But having said that, why I had this symposium and to bring out other voices is a lot of the voices are not heard about Alexander Solzhenitsyn, and some things have to be told. And that is that Alexander Solzhenitsyn, despite the Gulag Archipelago and these and serving as a symbolic force and a real force against the Soviet regime and telling the truths of its evil, he also was not really for pluralism and democracy, and he was critical of other dissidents, and he was an elitist in many ways. He didn't, he kept himself at arm's length from other very brave dissidents.
He embraced
them
Putin.
Down. And at the end, what really disappointed our family, also he was a Russian nationalist, and betrayed in some ways ideologically the cause of freedom and supporting Western democracy at the same time. So he's a complicated figure. And it explains that in the end he went back and shook hands with Putin. Now, how do you do this? And I mean, Putin represents this mafiosa KGB thuggery, the worst of the Soviet Union in power today in Russia, represents the ideology and the system that had imprisoned Solzhenitsyn to begin with. So in many respects, on the one hand, we give him our admiration, respect for the figure that he was and what he accomplished, and yet a tremendous disappointment on other levels in terms of being for freedom and ultimately shaking hands with Putin.
Jamie, in our last few minutes, there's a couple things I want to touch on. They're very important with regard to High Noon. What I want to touch on here now, Front Page Mag, David Horowitz, yourself, Robert Spencer, and all the people involved, there's a lot of bravery at work here with regard to radical Islam, the recent Arab Spring, etc. When you look at how a man like Geert Wilders, the Danish politician, is treated for reporting accurately on Islam, how Robert Spencer is treated for reporting accurately on Islam, never mind their opinions. Here's what the Brotherhood wants, here's what the Muslim Brotherhood wants, here's what they do. Just reporting on it will earn you the title Islamophobe. And so I just ask you, you guys are some very brave souls. Do you worry about your own reputation? Do you worry about being smeared for speaking the truth about the Arab Spring and radical Islam and the Brotherhood?
Look, we're entering a very dangerous time. We have a president that the other day made this scandalous, shameless statement that the future must not belong to the slanderers of the Prophet of Islam. So who are you talking about? Because I'm going to tell the truth till my dying day about things, including what the Islamic history and theology tells us about the Prophet Muhammad. And so freedom of speech is under attack in our own society, not just from destructive forces here and there, but from the White House. So, Josh, we need to be brave, but I will say that if my father and my mother put their lives on the line in the Soviet regime, what right do I have to live in America and stay quiet? If it's not going to be me and you to be the ones that say something, who's going to say it? Look, Obama wants to get into power, or whoever, in the future, if the leftists control our culture and government, they want to start imprisoning people, hey, I'll be one of the first to go, because if you don't say it and I don't say it, who's going to fight for freedom?
Now, in our last minute or two here, it's very important that we talk about Mr. David Horowitz. Let's talk about your working relationship with David. How you edited Left Illusions, a collection of his work. Just tell me in our last minute or two here, how did your relationship with David Horowitz unfold, and what does it mean to you?
Well, I mean, look, to begin with, he's simply a giant for the cause of freedom. David Horowitz comes from the belly of the beast. He was in that enemy the enemy camp in the sense of the enemy to freedom, but David Horowitz comes from the left, and he knows how they think. He knows this destructive movement, and he has had the courage to intellectually decipher and tell the truth about the left, but also be an activist and turn the tables on the left. There's nobody else that knows how to fight the left the way that David Horowitz knows.
How did you meet? Tell me quickly before we sign off.
And so I was so inspired by David's work, and while I was doing my own work, that I wrote a script, 15 Tips on How to Be a Good Leftist, and I read Radical Son, that changed my life on many levels. And this is must reading, David Horowitz's memoir of his movement from left to right. And I wrote David a letter in terms of how touched I was by that book, and I put my script into the envelope. And he ended up calling me, and I ended up coming to fight. He's on the front lines, and it is an honor and a privilege to be fighting next to this man. And I will tell you that history will record that it is David Horowitz and heroes like that that pave the foundation for our liberty in the future if we're going to be brave enough to fight for it, because people like David Horowitz are telling us how we have to equip ourselves and defeat this monstrous totalitarian evil.
Jamie Glazov, thank you for the opportunity. It's been a pleasure discussing your life and work.
I appreciate it. Thank you.
Folks, thanks so much for joining us. Check out High Noon for America, The Coming Showdown, and of course, United in Hate. Thanks so much to author Jamie Glazov. Have a good night.